When Final Fantasy XIII came out, it received some pretty rave reviews from plenty of reviewing outlets. But one criticism that a lot of reviewers gave was about how linear the game was. Unlike previous iterations in the Final Fantasy series, the path you take is very small, overworld travel is gone, and going backwards usually isn't an option. In response, the game's director Motomu Toriyama had this to say: "We think many reviewers are looking at Final Fantasy XIII from a Western point of view. When you look at most Western RPGs, they just dump you in a big open world and let you do whatever you like. It becomes very difficult to tell a compelling story when you're given that much freedom." By saying this, Toriyama addresses a clear divide that he sees between Japanese-made RPGs and the RPGs made in the West. By his argument, the JRPG is naturally linear, and that those complaining about the linearity are thinking of the game from the wrong perspective. This got me thinking about that divide between Western and Japanese RPGs and why Western RPGs have their sales soaring while the JRPG can barely make cult classics now in the West. Now before I get on to my points, I would like to mention that I do not hate JRPGs as a genre. In fact, my favorite game is a JRPG from only 5 years ago. These are just observations I've made from playing games throughout my life and reading articles from around the web. Now let's start with this. Are JRPGs naturally more linear than Western RPGs? I would say yes, but most JRPGs aren't that linear. Now in the early days of programming games, you could either pick focusing on a story or on the gameplay, not both. The technology for including all that in such a limited space hadn't really come around yet. You can see the effect of this in games from both markets, actually. In Japan, you could have your Super Mario Bros. Or you could have your Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy, there's an overarching story with multiple characters and a world to explore, thus the combat was simplified to a turn-based mode relying upon numbered health that was relatively simple to program and didn't take up too much space. Super Mario Bros. On the other hand required physics, precise enemy placement, level design, and a much increased emphasis on movement and jumping. In the West you can see this play out as well. Replace Super Mario Bros. With Commander Keen and Final Fantasy with Ultima to get my point. Because of the lack of technology, two distinct types of play were created, but there's one notable difference in the RPG genre. In both Western and Japanese RPGs you have an overworld, but each culture handled it differently. In games like Final Fantasy, the overworld is the area in which the places where main quest objectives are located in. Sure, some side quests existed, but the focus was mostly on the main quest. In the West, however, the overworld was a place that you explored to not only complete the main quest, but also to complete many side quests through villagers and the like. Now, while I am oversimplifying things and I know it, I think the influences of these beginnings can still be seen today. In modern popular Western RPGs like Fallout 3, you have a quest tracker to help you leave the main quest and focus on others. But even in a JRPG with plenty of side content released around the same time like Persona 4, there is no quest tracker and the main story continues whether you want it to or not. You are allowed to look at side content, but it definitely isn't the focus. The second piece of attention you should know about the modern day RPG is how combat works. As I mentioned back in the day, you could only pick gameplay or story, not both. This affected both types of RPGs. In the West, you'd most often just run into enemies and damage them while taking damage yourself. However, in JRPGs the combat was more complex, relying on a turn-based combat system with differing choices and HUD. This is why I think JRPGs were originally more popular in places like America than their Western counterparts. Not saying anything against them, but their gameplay was being outclassed at the time. But around the time, that is, the early to mid-90s, where CRPGs were evolving with games like Fallout and first-person RPGs were beginning to catch steam with the Elder Scrolls Arena, the most popular Japanese RPGs were still turn-based and relatively similar to those of years previous. This is nothing against them, of course. They had no reason to change at the time, and in fact, some of those games were really good. And it's also worth mentioning that some JRPGs from the era were different, like Secret of Mana, for example. But JRPGs really hit their stride on the PS1 and PS2 consoles, while the most popular Western RPGs still sat upon the PC, which had only recently become super popular for gaming thanks to games like Counter-Strike and StarCraft, pushing people to consider it as a viable gaming platform. Games like Final Fantasy VII, Legend of Dragoon, Tales of Eternity, and other Final Fantasy games were releasing with great praise and sales. For many in the West, these were their first RPGs as their sales far outnumbered even the SNES RPGs. But alas, it was not to last forever. Those years of barely changing the combat system and having so many games use it in nearly identical ways, as well as an increased focus on visuals above anything else, finally caught up with the genre only about 7 or 8 years ago. And as Western developers were becoming more popular and talented with more open games that still offered great story, well, the crash seemed almost inevitable in hindsight. Besides something I'm about to get to that's really important, the JRPG hasn't really changed much in the past 20 plus years. While in the West we've had CRPGs, first-person RPGs, and like a million different MMORPGs all be popular at one point, the JRPG genre has still relied mostly on a turn-based combat system that hasn't really changed much except for maybe with Japanese strategy RPGs, which are notable but have never been the focus of the genre. Recently though, I have come to a conclusion. The JRPG is not dead. We just had too much of it. There's nothing wrong with playing a turn-based RPG, it's just a bit outdated and too much of it can make people sick of it. And I think Japanese developers are finally realizing this. My case in point is the Final Fantasy series, and most notably the games Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Returns and Final Fantasy XV. Both of these games take after another game though, a very notable action JRPG from 2002 called Kingdom Hearts, which is, as of writing, the 9th best-selling game ever on the PS2. Combining Japanese hack-and-slash gameplay with Japanese RPG elements and parts of Western culture mixed in with Japanese culture made Kingdom Hearts a very notable game for the PS2. Now while this whole action JRPG thing didn't really break out into the mainstream at the time outside of this game, we can still feel Kingdom Hearts' influence today in the two Final Fantasy games I just mentioned. Now that JRPG sales are down, even with good critical reception, it's easy to see why they decided to finally make the change. From up to this point, I have been speaking as if these two types of video games have lived in separate, non-mixing worlds, but I think today we can see some cross-mixing between the two genres. In Japan, we have games like Dark Souls coming out that play and look like a Western RPG but with Japanese aspects, and in the West we are seeing games like the Penny Arcade series emulating older Japanese RPGs. Personally, I think this is very important. If the sales were the usual, there would have been no need to change anything, but Japanese developers are responding and innovating to fix this, which I think is great. If we were still seeing the sales numbers from the PS1 era for JRPGs right now, then I don't think games like Demon's Souls and Recitar would have come out. Final Fantasy XIII was the game that personified everything people weren't liking about JRPGs these days, whether you liked the game or not. With simple combat, unoriginal art style, and linear gameplay, it became the genre's last straw. But I think this was for the better, because JRPGs are now evolving, and I would say getting better too. And it's not like the old turn-based stuff is gone either. You can still see that stuff in games like Ni no Kuni and Tales of Graces. Ultimately, I think the JRPG genre is due for a great comeback that's currently building, and I can't wait to see what will come out of that. Thanks for watching.